Recording. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Here we are in the course on human life bioethics and shifting gears into end-of-life issues today. But before that, always beginning with a little prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in us the fire of your divine love. We ask this in the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Okay, before moving forward, any questions or comments from previous lectures or the course as a whole? All right.
Father, I do have a question.
Yep.
Sorry. So then I'm a little confused, but again, I am not the.
Sorry, Christina, before going forward, the microphone issue is still fuzzy. I don't know if you have the new or your microphone.
Okay, let me try to fix it and I'll ask you later, okay?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Because
okay.
it just sounds, I cannot really hear the articulation of the words. Thank you. Okay, well, let's see. So we have been covering beginning of life issues, beginning of human life, bioethical issues, and a lot of it hovers around the whole reality that life begins at conception, fertilization. For any species that reproduces sexually, really, we're not an exception to that because biologically we belong to the animal kingdom, all right? And so that's just a fact of life, a fact of nature when life, an individual begins. So once we come to that conclusion, just by observing nature, that's why also we say that this course is evidence-based. In other words, we allow nature to tell us what's happening, what are the facts. And then the bioethical analysis is done on top of that, right? Based on what nature tells us. Then realizing that life begins at fertilization, that has tremendous consequences with regards to the bioethical analysis at the beginning of human life, mostly in the womb. And I find it providential that just this summer, was it 2 weeks ago, 2 Fridays ago, the Supreme Court of the United States reversed a landmark decision that was made almost 50 years ago, almost half a century, of Roe versus Wade. And I just want to comment a little bit on that before moving to end-of-life issues, simply because it's a tremendous impact on many levels, at the social level, political, economic, you name it. And I remember in '73, in January 22nd of 1973, I was in my 20s back then, and wasn't even thinking about the priesthood. I was finishing biology, and a bachelor's in biology at FIU here in Miami, Florida, totally secular state university. And as a young man, it hit me, it struck me very odd that everything I had been learning about human embryology for the past 4 years in secular institutions. So I did I did 2 years at Miami-Dade College first for the associate. Back then it was a junior college, most degree that the only degree you can get, the only 2 degrees you can get from MDC back then was actually it was MDCC, Miami-Dade Community College. You could get an AA or an AS, just an associate degree, because it was a community college that was feeder for other universities. And then FIU started in '72. And I started in '72 with FIU. It was part of the first class, the first promotion. We were under 5,000 students, was the whole university. It was an exciting time to be part of a new university, which has now become one of the largest state universities in Florida. More than 50,000 students with every possible program you can think of, not only in arts and sciences, but also medical school, law school, engineering school, you name it, they have it. So anyway, it was exciting, those pioneer years. And I was graduating with my bachelor's, humble little bachelor's in biology in '73. And it really struck me as a young man, just on the scientific part, right? That all of a sudden, abortion had become legal in the United States practically overnight. For the whole US, I really wasn't aware of the details that before '73, it was up to each state, and some states had laws that were regulating abortion from both extremes, from some states where abortion was totally illegal at any time, for any reason, to the opposite end, where abortion was legal practically up to birth, with some restrictions, maybe in the third trimester, health reasons, or something like that, including psychological health, right? So stress qualifies for a health reason under those terms. So in the 50 states, you had a full spectrum of possibilities for abortion, from totally illegal to basically totally legal. But with Roe v. Wade, as you know, because we covered it in the topic, right? All of a sudden, it became legal for the whole 50 states. And it really, really struck me very strangely, so that I became pro-life at that point. And in my naivete, I thought it was just ignorance on the part of the people at large. Of course, they don't have a bachelor's in biology. Most citizens don't have a bachelor's in biology. So I just figured they really didn't know the biological facts of fertilization and embryonic development and all that. But especially the whole issue of the genome, right? That the new individual of whatever species has 50% of the genome of the father and 50% of the genome of the mother, but that is a new individual. Anyway, that's when I became pro-life. Like I was saying, I wasn't even thinking about the priesthood yet. Priesthood came several years later when I was teaching biology at a Catholic high school. Anyway, really, this issue continued to entrench, right? And the various factions were set up, pro-life, pro-choice, etc. And it spilled into politics and into even economics and so forth. So as the years progressed and the years turned into decades, I just saw the American population very polarized on this. Not only that, we have to keep in mind that that abortion decision of the Supreme Court of legalizing abortion in the United States had tremendous international repercussions, okay? It went throughout the whole world like a seismic wave, if you will, because many other countries of the world, including Europe and other what we call developed or industrialized nations, look at the United States as the guide, as the panacea, as the ideal democratic society. So anything really that happens socially in the US or even technologically and so forth is copied in many other parts of the world. You can think of, for example, blue jeans and rock music and so forth. It's just copied automatically because unquestionably that is the standard of democracy and freedom and so on and so forth. And you can see the perception that if abortion became legal in the United States, right, then that basically became like the flag of freedom, right? The ultimate freedom to choose. It's the interpretation of privacy in an absolute way, totally unrestricted privacy. And so really, as the years progressed into decades, like I was saying, I kept being involved in pro-life, the march in Washington and many talks and conference and so forth. I never really thought in my mind that I would see the reversal of Roe v. Wade. Really, I was very skeptical about it, simply because the population was so entrenched into either one of the two camps. And the polls, it depends on how you read the polls, how the questions are asked and so forth, but globally, I would say more or less, it's about half and half of the American population, pro-life or pro-choice, with various nuances. For example, if you start getting into the details of the pro-choice people, well, you have the full gamut again, from some who would say, on one extreme, who would say unrestricted abortion for whatever reason is just absolutely the woman's choice, and that's it, to the other extreme, where they would put a number of regulations and so forth according to embryonic development, pretty much a proportionalist argument, right? The more developed the embryo or the fetus was, then the more restrictions those other people would put, and so on and so forth. But globally, I would say more or less half, with divided population, half and half. And that's really why I thought it was, there's no way of coming to a compromise here when the population is so divided on this issue, which is really a life issue, no question about it. But then all of a sudden, there it is. It did happen, and it happened, I'll tell you, from the theological perspective, and specifically from the Christian perspective, it was very significant that it happened on the day that it did. First, we heard about the leak, right? And then the leak was confirmed, I think, by the Supreme Justice, who is Justice Roberts. And he confirmed that the leak was real. This was back maybe April or May. And that there would be the official decision, the official verdict in June sometime. Then, well, it came the last Friday of June, right? Which happened to be in the Christian world was the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the solemnity of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. The Sacred Heart of Jesus is a very pastoral feast, right? That commemorates the mercy of God in the person of Jesus Christ, specifically through his heart. Now, the heart, of course, is allegorical language, right? Because we know that biologically the heart is a muscle, it's a cardiac muscle. And what it has to do basically is pump. It's a pump that starts about 18 weeks after fertilization and continues until it stops. And it could be a few days, a few months, a few years, or a few decades later. The average lifespan for humans is about 80 years old in the United States, about 78 for men. And we'll see today in today's lecture, the number one killer still for men today in the United States is heart attack. So the ticker has to continue ticking, right? For a full lifetime, if that's God's will. At any rate, we know that biologically it's a muscle. However, analogically or in symbolic language, we talk about the heart in contrast with the mind. And they say that there is the longest distance in the human body, the longest distance between two organs is about a foot, right? Which is the distance between the mind and the heart. In other words, the intellect, the pure logical intellect, think of Dr. Spock of Star Trek, just pure logic, unbridled, unmoved by any kind of sentiments, passions, or feelings, right? That was Dr. Spock. Spock. This is just a mathematical, logical mind. In contrast with the heart, the feelings, the sentiments, the emotions. In fact, we see that a lot of issues in today's society are emotional issues, right? There will be one lecture for the Bio 510 students on transgenderism. And that's one of the ones that I will just send you the video and the PowerPoint, okay? But basically, we see that the arguments there are arguments of feeling. How do I feel? I feel that I'm in the wrong body, sexually speaking. So how to find the balance and the wisdom, which is a balance between our sentiments and our logic, our reasoning, our abstract reasoning. How to find the balance, that's really what we call wisdom, right? Kind of halfway between the heart and the mind. But anyway, back to the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus represents that compassion, which is a Latin word, again, the little added value of Latin in this course. Compassion is a compound word, compatire, which means to suffer with. Passion really is to suffer, right? The passion of Christ, for example, his passion, death, and resurrection, his suffering. So compatire is to suffer with. Psychologically, I think they call it empathy or something like that. But basically is to walk in the shoes of someone who is suffering, to accompany that person in their suffering. In fact, Pope Francis in the Catholic Church talks about that, the ministry of accompaniment, accompanying those who are suffering, either physically, mentally, or spiritually. As, for example, the ministry that we do in the Catholic Church and in Christian communities at large, and many other religions too, visiting the sick, visiting the ill, and accompanying them, right? That presence in itself, we believe has healing potential. Anyway, that's when the decision came out, and we call it providential. Really, I don't know, and I don't know that we'll ever know if it was done on purpose or not, but that was the last Friday they had in June to publish their official decision, right? And so that's when it happened, 6-3, which is 2/3. It wasn't just even a simple majority, as would have been 5-4, for example. It was 2/3 of the current Supreme Court justices. So there it is, and immediately we saw the consequences, good and bad, throughout society, and it's not over, it's actually just beginning. But I do want to comment, again, starting always with the facts, right? Because the facts are the ones that speak about the truth, and the truth is the one that makes us free. So the fact is that in this decision of the Supreme Court, reversing Roe v. Wade, essentially what it means that is it goes back to the states. In other words, at least 3 of the 9 Supreme Court justices, after careful review of the document of the United States, the Constitution of the United States, federal constitution, because keep in mind also that there is a federal constitution, right? There is a US Constitution, and then there are state constitutions. Most states have also their constitutions, but their nature is different. And if you think about that a little bit, I'm not an expert about law at all. However, over the decades of life, I've picked up a few things, living for more than 50 years, more than half a decade here in the United States, half a century. The state constitutions are supposed to be dynamic and should evolve and should change periodically. should change. And you can see that in various states, the process for amending the state constitution is a fairly accessible process and so forth. So it typically happens in the state, in coordination with the state legislature, right? And so the state constitutions should be dynamic and should be updated periodically, precisely because individual states progress in life, right? They progress technologically, they progress economically, fiscally, etc. And even the populations change and shift. States, populations increase and decrease according to a number of factors in society, and their ethnic makeup also changes and so forth. So state constitutions really should be dynamic and being updated periodically. Whereas the US Constitution should be static. In other words, it's written once and for all. The amendments were done early on, and that's it. You know, it's kind of a closed canon, similar to the Bible, sacred scripture, the books of the Bible. It's a closed canon now. We don't add or subtract books of the Bible because it has that integrity of really millennia of having been written. And so that's the US Constitution. It's really one of the foundation documents, together with the Bill of Rights, of the country as a whole. And because it is for all 50 states, right, it's all encompassing, then it should also be interpreted in a conservative way. In other words, meaning that one should not try to update the US Constitution, but rather try to figure out what was the mind of the founding fathers of the nation, who were the ones who put it together, okay? Because that gives stability to the United States as a whole, and it protects really the fundamental freedoms that we have for all 50 states. And so you see there's a nice balance there between the US Constitution and the state constitutions. And so basically, the reversal of Roe v. Wade means that it goes back to individual states, pretty much the way we were before 1973. However, with the added value of 50 years, practically half a century of information, of new information, especially biological information, right? At a very sophisticated level, down to, well, for example, the whole human genome has been deciphered in the meantime and published, and it's free online. Anyone can mine the human genome online for free throughout the world. All one needs is access to the internet. And so the amount of data that has come up since these 50 years is just amazing and spectacular. Think of the sonogram, for example, also again invented, I think it was invented maybe the 80s or something like that. And all that came since Roe v. Wade. So we see now the overwhelming biological evidence of embryonic life from fertilization all the way to birth, including also the data from IVF clinics. IVF clinics also contribute data because they are fertilizing these embryos in the lab and so forth, and then incubating them, and the blastocyst is the one that implants and so forth. So we have a tremendous amount of data and information now that speaks of the life and the humanity of the human embryo all the way up to birth and then beyond, right? So that is certainly an added value that will help now individual states figure out what they want to do, with regards to the regulation of abortion within their state. And so it really reverts back to the people, because now we don't have a direct influence on the Supreme Court justices. We don't elect them directly. You know, there are two filters there. We elect the president, who elects the justices, but even the president is a representative democracy that we have, right? We don't have direct vote. We have to go through that college of electors and so forth. So there are at least two huge filters from the American citizens to the Supreme Court justices. However, at the state level, we have much more direct access to the state legislators who are, and to the appointment, the actual appointment of state justices that come up in the ballots, of the state ballots, okay? And so really, the power of the people, government for and by the people is at the state level. And that's why we are a United States of America, okay? So it goes back to the state level, and really, in a sense, now the battles begin. Now the work really begins at the state level, and therefore we should engage at that level, of course, if we are citizens, to register and to vote with conscience, studying the issues carefully, talking to other people about the issues, and always seeking the truth. That little phrase, only the truth sets us free. Mm-hmm. And that statement is so true in itself. Just think about it, reflect. It is truly the truth that sets us free. Mm-hmm. And we have to stand up for the truth, defend it respectfully, but consistently and persistently. So that's my take. Okay, we go forward. I don't know, any questions or comments? Feel free. That's why this free country and this free university. Okay, so if anyone has any comment, feel free.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better, Christina. Go ahead.
Two comments or two things.
Yep.
The first one is that I think in terms of the hours that we need to do, that this might be a fabulous opportunity because of the,
Oh, okay.
I think at Mass last weekend, you saw everybody was already talking about what happened and people have questions. So I think it's a great opportunity for us. I hope so. Yeah. I mean, I think that was providential. The other question, the question that I have regarding last class, and again, I apologize to everybody here because I think everybody's in the medical field, but I am not.
Not everyone. Well, it's a broad range.
Okay, but a lot of them are, and this might sound very, very stupid and elementary question, but
the only stupid question is the one that's not asked.
Okay, so I think I understood in a way, because at the beginning when you talk about the cloning, that they don't use the male sperm, that confused me a little bit. But then with Enrique, my husband, talking, he helped me understood that when they take the somatic cell that already have the other chromosomes that are needed. So is that how it happened? And that's why when the last comment that was made, I think by one of the doctors, and I just want to clarify that in my mind, the reason why the excess of chromosomes comes because of that, is that what, well, why it's not working?
Sorry, your last statement, I didn't hear correctly.
Okay, so the somatic cell has already the combination, the 50 and 50.
Complement, diploid. Mm-hmm.
Right, so once they implanted that in the nucleus of the mother cell, now they will have
egg.
Exactly. Huh? They will have not only, they will have an excess of X number. The other 50% is already in excess. Is that correct? That's why.
No, not quite.
Okay.
Let's follow the biology, because at least theoretically, it's really very clear, and it has to do with haploid and diploid, okay? Now, these are terms that you should all be familiar with right now. Diploid means a full complement of chromosome pairs, which in the case of humans is how many, Christina?
46. I unmuted myself.
46 or 23 pairs, right?
Exactly.
So when we say 46 or 23 pairs for any, and those are somatic cells, right? In other words, any cell of our body except the gametes, because the gametes are haploid. So it's very, it's crystal clear. Again, talking about the norm. I'm not talking about abnormalities, chromosomal abnormalities, but the norm. Somatic cells are diploid, and they are the vast majority of the cells in our body. Throughout the whole body, the trillions of cells that we have. There it is, trillions of cells. In fact, they're also specialized. In other words, they are fully differentiated and they're functioning, they're doing their function. Nerve cells, liver cells, skin cells, et cetera, right? The whole 220 cell lines that we have more or less, they're all fully specialized, they're doing their function, they're metabolizing, they keep us alive. Okay, those are all somatic cells, full complement of chromosomes, which is another interesting thing that I'm gonna bracket for now, but I want to really reflect, I want all of you to reflect on this little issue in a moment. But we have a full complement of the entire genome in every single cell of our body, except the gametes. The gametes are haploid, meaning they don't have duplicate chromosomes. They only have one set, which is the 23, but they still have like the complement of a human genome, but there are no duplicates. So in those 23 chromosomes, all the genes that make up the human being are included, all right? But there's no backup, there are no duplicates. And when I talk about genes, it's estimated anywhere between 10 to 20,000. Most scientists lean toward 10,000 because you have alternative gene expression and so forth. It gets a little fuzzy, but let's put it in the middle. Let's say that the human genome is made up of 15,000 genes, 15,000, 1.5. It's not a big deal. I mean, you think about it, 15,000 genes make up everything in our body, every single protein in our body, which are probably hundreds of thousands of proteins. Okay, they all come from 15,000 genes. So the gametes, whether egg or sperm, each have those 15,000 genes, but they have no duplicates. They have no backup. And that's why also they're delicate cells, because if a mutation occurs in any one of those 23 chromosomes, and then that sperm or that egg is the one that is fertilized, that mutation in principle is going to be passed on to that new individual, right? Okay, so back to diploid cells. The diploid nucleus is a somatic nucleus, right? That has a full complement of chromosomes, chromosome pairs. And that is what is swapped. So remember that cloning is a nuclear swap, right? We start with an egg that is enucleated. So now we just have the cytoplasm of the egg. Why the egg? Why not just another somatic cell? Well, think about it functionally. Somatic cell is differentiated, it's fully differentiated, right? So a somatic cell is not a precursor cell like the egg that when fertilized will develop into a zygote and then the embryonic stages. Somatic cell is already functioning as a fully specialized cell. So it's no longer totipotent. It is fully differentiated. But the egg is totipotent. Now we do enucleate the egg, right? So the nucleus, the genetic material of the mother from where the egg comes from, right? By definition, again, an egg needs to come from a female who would be the mother. It's just a cytoplasm. However, that cytoplasm of the egg is vital, is crucial. Why? Because in that cytoplasm, in the cytoplasm are the factors, are the proteins that are the regulatory proteins that direct early embryonic development. See? So again, think about the fertilization process. We have egg and sperm fuse, just a normal process. Egg and sperm fuse, the two pronuclei fuse, we have syngamy, right? But then, what is directing that first cell, that zygote? What is directing that zygote to undergo mitosis within 24 hours? See, Those are regulatory proteins that are in the cytoplasm of the egg that are directing or orchestrating, because it needs a jump start. You know, those genes are not expressing yet. And so that zygote needs a jump start to get it started. Kind of analogous to when you have a gasoline car, you know, the gasoline motor needs an electrical motor, the starter motor, to get the pistons going first, to get that combustion going. All right. You don't have that in electric cars because you just have one big electric motor. But gasoline motors need an electric motor to get them started. And that's kind of just a rough analogy of the factors in the cytoplasm of the egg when syncope occurs, right? To get that egg, to get that zygote going, to undergo mitosis, so on and so forth, cell division through the moral stage, up to blastocyst, etc. So why am I saying all this? Is because in cloning, what is bypassed is fertilization, precisely. There is no fertilization. In other words, there's no fusion of egg and sperm. However, the end result is the same. We end up with a zygote or a zygote-like cell, which is really a composite. It has the cytoplasm of the egg, but it has a somatic nucleus. So it's equivalent, you know, to syngamy, but without syngamy, without fusion of two pronuclei, right? So we're bypassing fertilization, therefore there's no sperm, but the end result functionally is the same, which is an egg cytoplasm with a somatic nucleus, which functionally is the end result of syngamy, right? Okay, so did you follow that? And that's why if there's no sperm, there's no father.
Yes, I understood. It's very crazy though.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, especially when we apply it to the human, all right? Because in principle, for animals, we could justify it if there was some kind of benefit to humanity. For example, in animal husbandry, again, I gave the example of a cow that produces a lot of milk. Well, you may want to clone that somatic nucleus of that cow and see what happens. You may get 100 new cows, clones of that one that also produce a lot of milk, extra, you know, more than the average cow. So I'm just giving you one example, okay? These are things that, so different individuals have advantage, selective advantage, right? And that may be justified mostly in the animal husbandry field. When it comes to then the pet industry, it's a luxury. Of course, people have money, people want to clone their pets. Well, if they can justify that, as opposed to giving it to charity or something, I can think of much more worthy causes to spend money other than cloning pets, because it is expensive. I mean, to the tune of several $1,000s. It's boutique industry. But again, we're in a free country, and if they can justify it in their conscience, you know, it's up to them. But you can see that in animal husbandry, particularly, there may be some advantages, or even in some medical area. Okay, there could be some advantage. I don't want to take more time to think about an example in a clinical setting where cloning an animal may have advantage, but it may. We'll leave it at that. In the human, it's different, simply because we're now talking about human beings. Precisely, we're talking about ensoulment. We're talking about individuals who have fundamental rights, even before civil rights, right? We have fundamental human rights. For example, we have a right to a father, to a biological father, as we have a right to a mother, because that is the natural process. And it comes, yes, it comes out of what we call natural law, which is prior to civil law. Right? In fact, a good civil law, what is known as positive law, is based on natural law. For example, do not murder, right? Murder is a crime in many countries of the world. And why is it a crime? Well, because we're taking innocent life and we don't have a right. Why don't I have a right to kill another human being? Because that human being has a natural right to be alive and to stay alive. See, so ultimately, good positive laws are based on natural law. And that's a good thing because we believe, now we go into theology, that natural law comes from divine law, from God, who is the author of nature and the author of life. And that's why he is omnipotent, right? So you see, there's a nice, beautiful progression in classical theology from divine law to natural law to positive law. In fact, when you please read the decree of the reversal of Roe v. Wade that the Supreme Justices just did. Read it, and you'll see how they point out, point by point, the faulty logic of Roe v. Wade. And they pointed out, and they based it precisely on the document on the US Constitution. There's no mention of the unborn in the US Constitution. So how can you have a presumed right to a non-entity in the Constitution, you see? And so when you read the arguments, they point out, point by point, the faultiness of Roe v. Wade, based on the Constitution. So that's why, again, why am I saying this? Yes, we make the distinction. That's why I started with the distinction between human and non-human, right? So when we talk about human cloning, whether it's therapeutic or reproductive, we see so many injustices happening there in that process. In the case of human themselves, precisely because of our humanity. Okay.
No, I don't want to continue because I know it takes a lot of time from everybody, but yep. The other thing that comes to me is if we say that the soul is given a fertilization, then my God, that's another issue that is serious. Anyway, that I just want to leave it there, sure. Father. Well, thank you. But
I do need to address it because, again, I always teach to the norm, right? We normally talk about the norm, which is the norm is fertilization. However, by extension, we really cannot get into the mind of God and much less tell God what to do, right? that would be supreme arrogance. However, it's logical, it's reasonable. And we say things like God cannot be unreasonable, right? God cannot be cruel and so forth. So it would be unreasonable if human cloning were to occur. If human cloning were to occur indeed, you know, if indeed Dr. He did do that, did manufacture Lulu and Nana in the lab, and they are living human beings, we need to assume safely that Lulu and Nana have a soul, are ensouled, okay? And so when did God grant a soul to them? We would have to conclude that it was at the point when the cloning was done, right? When the cloning was done, when the fusion of the somatic nucleus with the enucleated egg was done, at that moment, God was, we say, for lack of a better word, forced to grant a soul to that individual. Why? Because the alternative is to not grant a soul, and that means to leave a human being soulless, literally. And that discussion also came up early on when in vitro was invented back in the 80s, in 79, 80. I remember theologically, it was being discussed because I was in the seminary at the time. Will these in vitro babies have a soul? Did Louise Brown have a soul? You know, and that was a real question that was asked theologically. I'm sure Father Dan and Father Steve, Father Franco, you may recall those discussions in the seminary. And she looked human, she was behaving like a human, she, you know, and so we have to assume that she did have a soul, that she was in soul, because I cannot think of anything more cruel for God to do is to leave a human being soulless, literally soulless. That human being has no possibility of redemption, has no possibility of eternal life, okay? And so it's such a horrendous contradiction of anything else that we see in nature that I cannot fathom God leaving a human being without a soul. It's his prerogative, certainly, but I can't imagine it, you know. So maybe that's the limits of our reasoning, that's the limit of our understanding, of our wisdom. But I think that in all honesty, we have to assume that every human being that we see around has a soul, is ensouled, including the in vitro babies that have grown up over the past 40 years, and including potential human clones. Okay, so we, again,
Thank you.
you know, in theology, also in philosophy and in theology, we also seek clarity. Clarity, very important, because confusion, and that's how the evil one works, right? By ignorance, by confusion, by doubt. And then one of the first things that doubt does is paralyzes us. And there's that little saying, all we need for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing, because they're inhibited. Well, education is about clearing ignorance, right? Forward, forward. Okay, I'll still get you up by 12:30, I promise. It's not too long. You'll follow the arguments here. We'll start again with baby steps on the end of life issues. But the first thing that I need to restate, which I already have said before, is that in contrast with the beginning of life, at the end of life, we have trillions of cells that are functioning, right? And they don't all die at the same time. They definitely don't die at the same time. Now, when we put cells into organs and systems, basically what I'm saying is that even vital organs do not all die at the same time. And therefore, the death process from that perspective is more fuzzy. The end of life is more fuzzy than the beginning of life. This is for humans and non-humans, but we're going to stick to humans, right? And so at the beginning of life, we have one cell, and that zygote is either dead or alive. And based on that conclusion, then we go forward with the bioethical analysis. If he or she is alive, then we have a human being. If he or she is dead, now we have, a cadaver. So at the end of life, trillions of cells making up, including our vital organs, then the death process is more of a process, right? And yet, the challenge is that a person at some point needs to be declared dead, clinically dead, kaput, over, so that now that cadaver may be buried, because we certainly don't want to bury the living, right? You'll see that as we progress, that has happened in the past, and we even have some very graphic, gruesome evidence of that to come. So trillions of cells. And because the cell is the basic unit of life, we need to review a little bit that issue. So basically what I'm covering today is these three main topics. Vital organs, which by definition define keeping us alive, right? That's why they're called vital. The major causes of death in the US, just to have some more background. And then the distinction between assisting or substituting vital organs. This is really the bioethical analysis. So this is one of the key principles that are used in principle bioethics to determine the end of life, the end of human life, the distinction between assisting or substituting vital organs, right? Also because, see, what happens is bioethical language and clinical language don't always intersect. And jumping a little bit ahead of time, like I do sometimes, what we may consider extraordinary means of life support bioethically, think of what I'm saying, bioethically extraordinary means of life support, clinically may be considered standard practice, standard medical practice. I'm going to give you 3 examples at the end of the lecture today where you can see, and we need to bridge the gap of the language, the bioethical language and the clinical language, because we have a patient in front of us here and now who is dying. And when has this patient died, right? Okay. So forward. Vital organs. Before vital organs, right, which are here in the hierarchy of organization, biological organization, just very, very brief review that the cell is the basic unit of life organically. I'm talking organically, right? Not metaphorically or symbolic, just life, hardcore metabolism. Remember the two capacities for being alive: metabolize and reproduce. Okay, so the cell, individual cells metabolize and they reproduce typically by mitosis. So that's a biological unit. It turns out that there's a whole world of unicellular organisms who are microscopic on Earth, protozoans, and you name it, plankton, etc. They cover the Earth. We don't see them, but they're there, and they're a vital part of the food chain. Actually, they get the food chain and the food web started. But for humans, we're certainly not unicellular, except at the very beginning of life, when we're a zygote. For 24 hours, we're unicellular. Interesting. Then after that, on average, we become more and more multicellular, and we spend the rest of our lifetime accumulating cells to the tune of trillions. So cells that have similar function become tissues. And for those who are doing your outline, I'm here on the outline, the first part. You can just start filling this area directly, if you will, moving forward. So cells with similar function form tissues. Tissues with similar functions, they form organs, and organs with similar functions form systems. Then there is a shift, all right? Notice that I'm adding structure and function together, right? A cell, a tissue, an organ, a system is something that exists physically, physiologically, but they are also functioning. There's a shift now from similar to different, because systems of different functions together form the entire organism, right? So systems of different functions, for example, the respiratory system does one thing, basically gas exchange, right? The circulatory system does something else, circulates those gases and nutrients and waste throughout the body. Okay? So organ or systems with different functions together form the organism, which means there has to be an integration of those systems. And what is the integrating system? The nervous system, right? Both central nervous system and peripheral nervous system and so forth. So the nervous system is the one that integrates all the other systems to function in concert so that we have a living organism, a living individual. In other words, if I were to lay out the dozen systems, more or less, that we have here on the table individually, and I have the circulatory system and the respiratory system and the digestive system and the nervous system all laid out here on the different desks individually, I don't have a living organism, right? It's obvious. They need to be integrated, put together. And the bag that puts them together, so the nervous system is the one that integrates functionally, but the one that holds all the other systems together is the integumentary system, which is the skin, basically, right? It is the bag that holds the individual together for human and non-human. So that's one of the dozen systems, more or less, integumentary. And I say dozen, more or less, I think I put 11 here. So just to review, the nervous system, the integumentary system, which have a common origin, by the way, in the ectoderm of the germ layers at the gastrula stage. Okay. Circulatory, respiratory, digestive, the immune system, which are basically individual cells, but they form, the macrophage, white blood cells, different eosinophils, etc. They form different. Those cells form tissues, and those tissues then, it's really a liquid organ. The circulatory system and its components is considered one of the two liquid organs of the body. Okay. And they have at least 3 different types of tissues. Blood, it's got the RBCs, the red blood cells, mostly engaged in gas exchange. Then the white blood cells, mostly involved in the immune system. And then the platelets that are mostly involved in healing in the scab, right? Forming a scab when there's an injury. And then there's the plasma faction, which has nutrition, etc., other stuff in it. But that circulatory system is different from another circulatory system that is the lymphatic system, right? Lymph, which is mostly nutrients. It's kind of a parallel system to the circulatory system, right? And it's moved, unlike the circulatory system that has a pump, which is the heart, the lymphatic system is just moved by squishing the muscles, skeletal muscle mostly. So then you got the muscular system, right? The skeletal system, reproductive, and the urinary system, the urinary tract, including kidneys, etc. Whereas, and you notice what's interesting about the organ systems is that they're form of organs, right? But first of all, not organ systems are vital. They're all important. They're all important, but technically they're not vital. For example, we can live without the reproductive system, right? And so the reproductive system, as important as it is not vital for the individual. It's vital for the next generation. But that's at the level of population. Which other system here may not be a vital system? I think all the others are vital. To different degrees, right? But really, when we talk about vital, we go down to the level of organ. So we talk about vital organs. And so vital organs is about a dozen. Again, looking at the human body, if we go from top to bottom, basically head and trunk and abdomen. Just if we go anatomically, the brain and the brain stem are 2 separate organs. Okay, and they have separate functions. Of course, they're part of the nervous system, but the brain does more of the active thought and so forth, whereas the brain stem controls the involuntary organs of the body, smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, including respiration and circulation. So the pumping of the heart, okay? And that's controlled by the brain stem. So because the brain stem controls vital organs, other vital organs of the body, then that is also a vital organ. And I mentioned this because obviously it has bioethical significance. The brain may be dead. The cerebral cortex has, for example, in a persistent vegetative state, PVS, but the brain stem is alive. So a person in PVS, prolonged unconsciousness, may not be moving or reasoning or articulating or interacting with the environment, but the heart is pumping by itself and the lungs are breathing. So that person is not dead. And therefore, we need to distinguish between the brain and brain stem. This will become very important when we talk about brain death, neurological criterion for death. All right, lungs. Again, you notice I'm combining here structure and function together. So the lung is a structure, the 5 lobes, right? But I'm talking about both lungs, all 5 lobes to be vital organ together. The heart as a whole, the liver, the pancreas, again, the 3 lobes of the liver, pancreas, stomach, the intestines individually. You know, one cannot survive without any stomach whatsoever. One cannot survive with the whole small intestine removed or the whole large intestine, as far as I know. Medical doctors, please correct me whenever I mess it up, okay? Both kidneys also functionally, because we know very well that a person can survive with a single kidney, all right? And so functionally, we have a list that, they have the pancreas in, yeah. Probably the smallest one of the list is the pancreas, vital organ. Okay. So now let's shift for a moment now that we have the basic biology settled, right? We move forward, just again, just as background information, if you will. It's a list that I found on CDC on the major causes of death in the United States. 15 major causes of death, and they're not equally ranked. And that's why I think this is informative going forward, looking at end of life issues, end of human life, right? Heart disease, tumors, cancer, basically. Cerebrovascular, like stroke, chronic respiratory diseases, then accidents, diabetes, influenza, pneumonia, respiratory, Alzheimer's, nephritis, kidneys, septicemia, blood poisoning, then human behavior, suicide, so accidents, number 5 and number 11 are human behavior, right? Liver, chronic liver disease, cirrhosis, hypertension, Parkinson's, homicide, another human behavior, and then all others make up almost 17% of human deaths in the United States. You can see this varying quite a bit from country to country, in part by the advancement of medicine in that particular country, etc., but also many other issues. Of the first 5, because I asked here, the first 5 somewhere, okay, we can see the first 5 make up 2/3 of all deaths in the United States. Heart disease, tumors, cancer, vascular diseases, especially stroke, basically this is stroke, then respiratory illnesses and accidents. Accidents make up 2/3 of all of the deaths in the United States. And of those 5, the first 2 make up 50%, more than 50% of all deaths in the US, which is heart disease and cancer. And further, just one more note of interest, these are not distributed homogeneously in the population. So we know that generally the population of any country, unless it's manipulated, is about 50-50. 50% women and therefore 50% men, even though statistically it's slightly more women. There's a reason for that that I'm not totally sure of, but it's like 50.5% women and 49.5% men, something like that. It's maybe half a percentage more on women. And because there are millions of people, that half a percentage is what we call statistically significant. And there's a reason for that. I'm not sure exactly why. It may have to do with this, but that women live a little longer than men. I'll get to those numbers later. But basically, with regards to here, the major cause of death in men, the major cause of male death in the US is heart attack, all right? Again, MDs, please correct me if I'm off the mark, but at least a couple of years ago when I'm still reviewing this. Yeah, okay. And further, we can even narrow it down. The window is in the 40s and 50s, right? Those 2 decades of 40s and 50s. I mentioned this because my father died of a heart attack at 65. He just dropped dead all of a sudden in Costa Rica one day on his last business trip. He had just retired in June. And then in August, he did a trip, last business trip down there. And that's when he died. It was tragic. It was horrible and sudden heart attack right smack in the middle of the, so he was actually beyond the average, but the average heart attack, 40s and 50s. But his dad, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, died of a heart attack at 55. And so it's there, it's in the background. Thanks be to God. Within a few months, I'll be 70. So I think that statistically, I've moved beyond the average, but still it's there. So I need to be careful with the ticker, as they say. Treat it nicely. Anyway, that's the major cause of death in the United States for men is heart attack, which is related to stress. It associates with stress, right? Stressful lifestyle that men live. A lot of it is work related. And so we need to review that. Now that we're reviewing social things like the legalization of abortion, then we also need to review this whole issue of stress. I'm all for the market economy, but I think that one downside of market economy, when it is abused and the bottom line, in other words, profit, it's the only determining factor and is driving the industry and is driven the board of investors and all this, it puts tremendous stress on people. And particularly the man who traditionally has been the breadwinner. I heard one time somewhere that the average American family moves from one city to another, many times from one state to another. An average, you know how much, how often? Every 6 years. Every 6 years, the average American family uproots and totally moves at least to a different city, if not to a different state. Imagine what that does to children, friends, other family members in the same city, and so on and so forth, okay? And adjusting. So a lot of stress from the economic system, and yet still the best one that I've seen is market economy, and I've lived in many different parts of the world. But there's the downside when it's, again, when it's absolutized, and profit is the only factor driving it, then we abuse the population, okay? And a double warning for women entering the workforce, because we know it's been an increasing trend and it continues, and I'm all for, you know, professional women getting their degrees, but I also say, quite frankly, there's a difference between a woman getting an academic degree, you know, getting a university degree, and a man getting a university degree, because we men don't bear the children, okay? And women do bear their children. And so at some point, what happens is that, well, the children go by the wayside because the woman has now become a professional. And imagine after years and years of blood, sweat, and tears to get that degree, by George, they're gonna put it to practice, right? And they're gonna go into the workforce and become professional, even full time. I know some families where the woman is even earning more than the man. It's just what's happening, you know, social trends, whatever. However, that puts tremendous stress. So I end up either not having children or waiting for the children into the 30s, but the clock keeps ticking and the biology is what it is. And then we go into aneuploidy and all that. So a lot, it's more stress on the woman who is studying today to become a professional than on the man. It's just a biological fact of nature. And these are things that need to be talked about with couples and so forth, you know, so
that's why the rate is increasing.
The rate of heart attack.
Yes.
There you go.
It is half the male. But before, you know, everybody was male. Now half of those
it's about
are females.
It is about half, huh?
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. So this is from one of our medical doctors in the course, that it used to be that all of the heart attacks in the US, or the vast majority of heart attacks, were men in their 40s or 50s. And now women are having heart attacks, and it's coming up to about half and half. Half and half.
Male and double and half.
Oh, I see. So, okay, so male is still twice as many.
Exactly.
But females used to have no heart attacks. And now they're catching up.
Too much obesity,
Father.
diabetes.
Okay, and the comorbidities, right? Exactly. The trifecta. What's the trifecta? Obesity, hypertension, and
High cholesterol and physical activity.
and yes, and lifestyle, sedentary lifestyle, right? The couch potato, no tennis shoes. Yes, yes, Dr. Jose, cardiologist.
Yeah, just on the heart attack prevalence and sexual differentiation of the outcomes, what tends to happen is that men still have the disproportionate number of heart attacks, but it's age dependent. And still women outlive men.
Yes.
So after a certain age, primarily postmenopausal,
Yeah.
Women's prevalence for heart attack, or incidence, I should say, incidence for heart attacks starts to catch up with the men. The men die younger, but the women continue to live, and there's a disproportionate amount of women versus men at an older age group that are alive. So then the data catches up, and they end up with the same more or less amount of heart attacks
Overall.
towards the end of life. Right. Overall.
Right. I see. Okay. So there's a sexual differential and there's an age differential there. And at the end, at the very end, they start merging, right? Yes.
Correct.
Yes. I think that in general, the woman's physiology, the woman's metabolism is more complex, of course, all the cycling and all that. But it also seems to be that the end result is that the woman's body is more robust somehow. And it may have to do also with the potential for childbearing and the actual childbearing and so forth. So it's definitely more complicated chemistry for women overall. And that may account for a little more longevity. But the stress is what it is, and it's out there in the workforce.
And an interesting additional point, giving some of the ethics of our, I would say, our current society, which is based on kind of consumerism, production, and so on,
Right.
is that because of the finances and economics that have evolved, the expectation is that we'll work older and older.
Yes.
That we won't. So actually, the stresses on the body become much more significant, since as we get older, we have a much more difficult time overcoming stressors or insults to our physiologic body or our mental capacities. So
Absolutely.
the forced older workforce is going to become an ethical issue for us. It's my dog.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, he's chiming in. Right, exactly. And I've seen that graphically. I've seen it even on the legal system, how the retirement age is being pushed back and back. Part of it has to do with the workforce coming in, or the lack of workforce, or the smaller numbers of young people coming into the workforce proportionately. So overall, the population, population is aging, right? Again, the clock only moves forward, and so the population is aging. We're seeing that in industrialized nations. Talked about that associated with contraception in the European population that is ahead of us on that mark. But we are also moving in that direction. So big social issues here, absolutely. Big social issues that are intertwined and need to be talked about. Definitely very, very important to have these conversations, and especially I encourage the youth to have these conversations, because we're passing, okay, but you're coming into the workforce. One more little anecdotal data, talking with some friends, even a friend of mine, he's an astrophysicist and he's running the astronomy program of NSF. So this man is really very brilliant. I have high admiration for him. He used to teach here for us at St. Thomas University. And he tells me that for science purposes, women are considered a minority in the United States. This is for grants. For example, NSF is the largest funding agency of non-human research in the world, not only in the United States. And in fact, they even sponsor international grants and so forth, international grants. Anyway, he says for the effect of science and grants, which has, you know, a mark, a tick, women are considered minority, even though they're actually, by that 0.5%, the majority of the American population, but there are fewer women proportionally in science today, which means that the ones who are scientists have a greater pressure on them. And he's telling me, for example, that these women who are scientists have a lot of pressure on them to have multiple hats and be giving talks and so forth, for encouraging other women to go into science and so forth. And so they have added pressure precisely because technically, and it's just a technicality, because it doesn't match up to the actual number of a minority, right? Every other minority is an ethnic minority that is a physical number minority in the population, but not women. But they're put that way as a technical minority because they're fewer by the numbers in science, which places more stress. And these are the social issues, and we have to push back. We have to push back with conscience, right? That's another aspect of conscientious objection. The freedom of the conscience, that after we come to some conclusions about this, we need to push back and say, no, it's not correct ethically, and therefore I'm going to go this other route. Like, for example, postponing, again, and I'm going to drop it here and then go into the break, all right? But postponing a career for women, postponing a career until they have their family, they have their children, raise their children. Now the kids are into school, or maybe even high school, and then they get their career. And so it's reversing the order of priorities. Give vocation the priority, in other words, forming the family, and then the profession secondary to the vocation, which means that the man, the husband, has to get out and work full time, right? And so again, you know, nature tells us a lot. And if we follow nature, we end up in the proper path. There's a wisdom in nature that, because nature has been here before us, we're part of nature, but nature supersedes us. And we can learn a lot from nature, including human nature. That's natural. I'm going to stop there, folks, for 10 minutes. Promise, 10 minutes. At 11, I will begin again. Okay? See you then. Okay.
Gracias, Padre,
Or not? Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. Moving forward. So now, first, any questions about vital organs? Questions, comments? Questions about the major cause of death in the US and some of the background driving it? Yamanaka. Yamara, the IPS cells, yes. Commenting with Dr. Farid. Right, IPS cells, yes. Some of the challenge, again, I have not revisited that discussion in a few years, because that was going on actually when I was doing my graduate studies at Purdue in genetics. So it was a very hot topic. But since it is such an artificial process of undifferentiating cells, we really don't know the long-term effect yet. But again, this goes back 20 years, so maybe now they knew more, right? But yeah, in principle, it has tremendous potential. However, it may be something parallel to the cloning aspect, that the clone ages faster prematurely, because no matter how you cut it, if we start with a fully differentiated cell, that cell has already been exposed to life for a number of years, unless we start using like newborn cells, right? From a baby, just a skin scrape or even just a swab of the mouth. We have cells of the baby, it does absolutely no harm. So maybe they would have greater potential.
It makes sense.
But it does. And even for that same baby, swabbing and developing, for example, IPS, hypothetically, they would be even better than the cord blood cells, because cord blood cells are already multipotent, whereas this would be pluripotent. But the idea, well, yeah, because he reverses to pluripotentiality. Anyway, it's all in the results, right? As long as it's ethical. But there are ethical alternatives. We can think creatively and come up with ethical alternatives that essentially don't harm or damage the human person, the human being significantly. Forward. The distinction between assisting or substituting vital organs, which is really the main point of this lecture, because it's at the level of principles, right? Bioethical principle. Some of you may be familiar with this principle already. I suspect that most of you have not been yet, but you will be within the next hour. This is the idea. There's basically, so here's the bottom line. Bioethically, there is an obligation to assist vital organs. There's an ethical obligation to assist vital organs, but there is no ethical obligation to substitute vital organs. Let's think about that for a moment. Assisting vital organs, well, the organ is vital. By definition, that organ is keeping the person alive. So assisting is helping. For example, we assist vital organs when we breathe, when we eat, right? When we exercise, etc. Those are natural assistants. There could also be an artificial assistance when there is some kind of impediment. If I'm bedridden, someone needs to cook for me and perhaps even feed me. And if I can't swallow, now we got to bypass the throat. But bypassing the throat, in principle, you know, the throat itself is not a vital organ, but the digestive tract is. And so the fact that the food is administered artificially, right, doesn't mean that it's extraordinary means necessarily. It may still be ordinary means keeping the person alive, but they need assistance. So that's assisting vital organs. They generally obligate ethically. But substituting vital organs does not obligate. Now, some people may have a challenge with this. Oh, substituting vital organs, well, it's a vital organ. And if we don't substitute the vital organ, the person will die. Yes, the person will die because we will die, right? Sooner or later, we will die. So substituting, imagine when we're not clear on a principle, it helps to turn it upside down and see if it makes sense. Imagine if there was an obligation to substitute vital organs. It's not tenable, it's not sustainable. You know, how do we substitute every failing heart, every failing kidney, every failing liver, lung, etc.? Please, it's not possible. First of all, organ transplantation has advanced a lot, but we don't have an unlimited supply of vital organs, right? And therefore, it's not tenable to substitute every vital organ that is failing irreversibly. Rather, when a vital organ starts failing irreversibly, again, words make different, words have meaning. When a vital organ starts failing irreversibly, guess what? The death process has begun. The death process has begun, and it may be subtle, but real. Why? Because we're made up of trillions of cells. So the death process may be subtle, but real when a vital organ begins failing irreversibly. And we only need one of those vital organs to be failing for the whole person to die, right? The other organs may be working fine. Okay, so you see the challenges that come up existentially
Father
when we
Chope,
talk
I have a
about the
question.
end of life. Christina.
Sorry to bother you, but I have
Go
a
ahead.
question because
Yep.
is it too late to try to do some kind of replacement of cells by the therapeutic you know, what we learned in the last class, that you can get a cell from that organ and try to reproduce it to see the organ regenerate. Is it too late when that process begins? It's not possible?
Right. Okay, you're talking about pluripotent or better multipotent cells. Let's stay, okay, so let's stay within a particular system, within a particular organ system. The cells are multipotent, right? The stem
Yes.
cells are multipotent, which are already predisposed for that organ system. Let's say the circulatory system or the muscular system. Let's talk about the muscular system, the heart, right? Cardiac heart. So can we use those multipotent cells, adult stem cells, to try to heal the heart? Well, we can, yes. And that's in fact what's being tried in all those different trials that are being done today. So yes, the multipotent cells, the adult stem cells, can be used and are being used to try to heal some of those vital organs for sure, all right, at different stages of success. One that comes to mind right away is the pancreas itself, and especially what they call islets, islets of the pancreas that were being introduced, injected to a patient with diabetes, where the pancreas was dying, all right, to try to regenerate that pancreas. And there was some success there. Then what happens, because these are clinical trials that are super regulated and studied, right? As soon as one of the patients in the trial comes up with some kind of contraindication or negative effect, then typically the whole study is stopped and everybody is taken off the experiment and so forth, because we don't want to risk the health or the life of these patients. So those are experimental procedures. And by definition, these experimental procedures in clinical trials are not standard of care. They're not standard medical practice. Okay, so yes, to your answer, but there are limits. There are limits, and it's a long way before we are actually able to substitute an entire heart from mesenchymal cells or heart or muscle precursor cells, all right, even if they come from the same patient. Another one that has good prospect, for example, is the liver. The liver, as you know, has 3 lobes, and I've heard that they can take out an entire lobe of the liver, for example, if there's cancer, right? And they can take out an entire lobe of the liver, and that lobe will regenerate because the liver has a lot of regenerative capacity. Well, seems to be that the liver has a lot of stem cells in it that are already predisposed for growing more liver tissue. See? So yes, but to a limit, right? And those limits are quite evident and quite a bit of limits. We're not at the stage where we can replace or substitute any of the vital organs with just stem cells. We can replace them with organ transplants, but then now we're talking about organ transplantation. Now, there'll be a whole lecture on organ transplantation, all right, for that. It's one of the lectures actually that I'm sending to the Bio 510 group. And then for the Bio 602, we'll have the lecture live in the course of healthcare bioethics. Okay, so let's look at some examples. I promised 3 examples of this, where there's a incompatibility between bioethical language and clinical language with regards to extraordinary procedure, bioethically speaking, which don't obligate. Extraordinary procedures, by definition, extraordinary means that they don't obligate ethically, and what is known as standard medical practice or standard of care. Dialysis for renal failure, right? So the question is, does dialysis assist or substitute the kidneys? Well, we're giving you here the answer, but basically let's walk it through. how does dialysis work? Here's the machine. This is a dialysis center. Everyone is either on a bed or one of these recliners. They have their individual machine. And what the machine does is it takes out the blood of the individual, puts it through the machine itself. Now you can see the actual filter. Here it is. All right. And filters out the toxins of the blood, just like the kidneys would do. And then those toxins are discarded. And the blood, the filtered blood, clean blood, right? Detox blood is pumped back into the individual patient. In doing this, of course, that those toxins are dissolved in the serum fraction of the blood, and they have to be taken out in the liquid fraction of the blood, which in normal circumstances in our body is what becomes the urine. Okay, and so water, kidneys filter out water from the blood, but it's not just pure H2O. It's water that has the toxins in it that are also filtered out by the kidneys, sent to the bladder, and eventually we urinate that. That's also why urine, by the way, is sterile when it comes out, because it's coming from within the body. Now, that filtering, of course, involves water. And so the machine also has to pump water, pure water, into the blood of the individual to maintain homeostasis, right? Homeostasis is the blood pressure of the body, which is regulated by the amount of water in the blood. And so that homeostasis is important, is essential, because otherwise the patient could have a drop in blood pressure or an increase, sudden increase in blood pressure, which will trigger typically a heart attack, or secondarily could cause also a stroke. But the heart attack is the big to-do here with the dialysis machine. Therefore, the patient also needs to sign, every time the patient goes on the machine, needs to sign a release form with regards to cardiac arrest. Even so, these centers, these dialysis centers are typically associated, they're right next door, physically next door to nephrologists, to MDs who have their practice right next door, okay? And so they're on call. And anytime that there's a problem inside the dialysis center, because the center itself is run by nurses, maybe even, what is the terminal degree there is nurse practitioner, right? The practitioner that can even prescribe and everything else. So they're monitoring this. These technicians are monitoring these dialysis machines ongoing. It's a dynamic system. And here you can see the bags of fluid that are being pumped, saline basically, that are being used by the machine. All right. This saline eventually ends up inside the blood of the patient. So it's a pretty sophisticated deal. It takes anywhere between 2 to 4 hours, more or less, on average. It depends on body mass. So they have to be weighed every time they come in. Aside from signing the release form, they also are weighed at that moment. And it's a body mass ratio that is determined to see how much water they're going to need in their blood system. And I mean, as a non-clinician, that's about all I know about this dialysis. I have some friends who have been on dialysis before, so know a little bit about it. So having known that now, this dialysis machine, is it assisting or substituting the kidneys? Functionally, I think it's pretty obvious that it's substituting the kidneys, right? In other words, the patients typically, they don't have to be on total renal failure, all right? But they typically are on total renal failure. Sometimes their kidneys function a little bit, but not sufficiently to keep them alive. In other words, they get intoxicated, and without dialysis, they will intoxicate to death. All right,
Father?
please,
Yeah, okay.
Franco.
Yeah, I have a kind of the confusion here. It is not the same person, the same blood that they take through this machine.
Yes,
And then purify it and then return it to the patient.
yes, there's no blood transfusion here. This is the patient's own blood that is being circulated out of the body through the filter and back into the body. In fact, you can graphically see here's the little pump, right? Back into the body.
Yeah, it is
So-
because it said that it is substitute. So this is my confusion. It's the word because it's the same blood.
It's the same blood, but blood belongs to the circulatory system, right? Now here we're talking about kidneys, which are part of the urinary system. Okay, they intersect with the blood circulatory system for sure, but technically the kidneys, the bladder, and the tubes that connect all the way out to the outside of the body, that's part of the urinary tract, urinary system. And the kidneys are vital organs by definition. Someone on total renal failure will die without dialysis, okay?
I think a
Yep.
component is that although substitution
Mhm.
may not be necessary ethically, it's not unethical to perform. So it's not unethical to do dialysis on someone.
Yes, exactly. And that's where I want to take it. So you see the distinction between standard medical practice. In other words, a patient on renal failure, the first thing that the doctor will do will prescribe dialysis, standard medical practice. In fact, a nephrologist typically is a nephrologist who is a specialist, right, on the kidneys, nephro, kidney. So the nephrologist will prescribe. A nephrologist who does not prescribe dialysis for a patient on kidney failure is liable, is suable, because it's medical neglect, right? In other words, dialysis has been around for decades. In fact, this machine is probably old. They're smaller today. There's one that can even be done overnight at home, yes, while the patient is sleeping. It's a portable thing, all right? It's got all kinds of bells and whistles in case there's a outage, it has battery backup, etc. But dialysis is standard medical practice. It's not experimental. It's standard medical practice. Okay, so that is a standard prescription. That is the standard medical clinical indication for renal failure. However, bioethically, because it substitutes the kidneys, it's not just assisting, but because it substitutes the kidneys, it's an extraordinary means of life support. Therefore, in conscience, a patient on renal failure at some point may say, no more dialysis. Thank you very much. I'm out of here.
And what if he says, I don't want the treatment at all?
That's exactly what I'm saying. In conscience, a patient on renal failure may take that decision, and some of them do after years, because the regimen, especially the standard regimen, is fairly taxing, is severe. Typically, a person is on total renal failure, okay? Total renal failure means that the kidneys basically shut down, they're not doing any filtering significantly. Without the dialysis, the patient will die. The regimen is 1 day off, 1 day on. Think about this. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, they go to dialysis. Or it could be Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Sunday, they have off. But the off day, they usually spend recovering from the dialysis because it's debilitating. It's draining. It's draining to be there 2 to 4 hours. It literally saps out. I don't know what it does to the ATPs, but they come out of there weak. And so they spend the off day typically recovering. And then what? Once they recover, they have to go back on again. So really, it's a very restricted lifestyle, right? Depends, of course, on a lot of things, right? If the patient is older, if the patient is overweight, if the patient has other comorbidities, meaning other illnesses or chronic diseases, etc. So many factors play into the decision. But especially for older patients, at some point, they may in conscience decide, I'm basically just living for the machine, you know? And so they may decide in conscience, I went out, my kidneys are gone. You know, my kidneys are shut down. Those are vital organs. By definition, my death process has begun. So at this point, what I'm doing actually is I'm extending my death process instead of extending my life. I know it's a difficult decision. It's a very difficult decision.
It's a right ethical decision.
It may be an ethical decision, yes.
Yes.
If the patient, so we have to go individual by individual. That's what we say. And in the medical practice, they say, you see one patient, you see one patient. You haven't seen them all. You see one zygote, you've seen them all, because the zygote is a single cell of whatever species. Okay, you've seen one zygote, you've seen them all. But you see one patient, you've seen one patient. Each patient is individual. And that individual decision, if it's well informed and after a lot of reflection and prayer and consulting with their loved ones and so forth, if the patient decides, take me off dialysis, then they're taken off dialysis. In fact, think about it. They can't really be forced to dialysis, right? What if the patient doesn't want dialysis? What are you going to do? You're going to strap them down and hook them up? Please, we're not, you know, we're still in the United States.
But Father Chaffee, I'm
Yes.
thinking, okay, somebody with diabetes type 1 who is young and, you know, I have diabetes and myself, I talk about myself. I have to take 14 medications because
Wow.
all the things that some days I feel like, what am I doing this, you know? But of course, I'm doing it because I'm alive and that kept me alive. But I know that at the end, at some point, something is going to happen. I'm not being fatalistic or anything. I'm just being realistic. But
Yep.
I understand. I understand all these procedures. I do. But if a person who is being told by the doctor today, you either have to do chemo, radiotherapy, or dialysis, and the person says, you know, because what you're saying is true, is debilitating. It's not really, when they said it's quality of life, but at the end it's not quality of life. What you're getting is an extension to die more painfully. That's what I think.
Right. Well,
so is
okay,
it all
so
right?
again,
Is it ethically okay for somebody who is in that predicament,
right.
who is a young person, to say, no, I don't want to go through this treatment?
Right. Again, it depends, no? So we have to go individual by individual, but you also have to go organ by organ. Because think about it. There's a difference between substituting the kidneys, which is the standard is dialysis, which is really a big to-do, right? All this. Or substituting the pancreas, which is basically an insulin pill or maybe an insulin shot. But even that shot, I mean, that needle is like a mosquito bite, right? So, and there's even a pump now. I have another friend, he's actually a bishop, and he has a pump, an insulin pump. And he pretty much eats and he loves sweets and everything else, but he also exercises. So again, lifestyle, right? He lives a healthy lifestyle and he's just about anything in sight. And he has a little pump that kicks in automatically when the insulin level goes down in his bloodstream. I mean, it's fascinating, but there's a big difference between substituting the pancreas or substituting the kidneys. See, there is clinically a big difference, realistically. And so I would think that someone saying no, a diabetic person saying no to insulin artificially supplied, would have a much greater burden of justifying that no. Typically, I would see it perhaps if they are what we call comorbidities. There are other factors that are maybe chronic and are factoring into that decision. And in my opinion, frankly, I would put age also at some point and so forth, you know, but again, we have to go patient by patient. But you see the difference, Christina, you see the difference between vital, not just because it's a vital organ.
No, I do.
Okay, some vital organs are more substitutable than others. And so, yeah, we have to go patient by patient. We have to go organ by organ, even if they are vitals. So there is also a ranking. You just made me think about this. that all vital organs are vital, but not all vital organs have the same ranking. Right? Okay. So that's one example. And I know it's challenging. And to tell a medical doctor, I'm not going on dialysis anymore, that medical doctor may be extremely frustrated and thinking, this patient is choosing to kill herself or himself, but maybe not. If you think about it from the bioethical perspective, the patient is really just allowing the death process to continue, to go its natural course. Okay. Like that, older, they are, especially after years and years. I knew one, for example, who was a bank executive, and he would go to the bank one day on, one day off, and to dialysis on the non-bank day, but he was just taking a huge toll. Eventually he had to retire prematurely, and it just became more and more and more debilitating. So again, patient by patient, okay? But I'm just saying that this principle of assisting versus substituting allows us to engage the particular illness from a bioethical perspective. All right.
Father, I think there's another component, which is more nuanced. So we wouldn't get into it, but which is risk and benefit. So
yes,
there is intrinsic risk, obviously, including death, to undergo dialysis.
Right.
And it doesn't in any way reverse the process, the pathologic process, as you say. It's a substitute. While if I have hypertension, let's say,
right,
there is very minimal risk of mine suffering death from taking a blood pressure pill appropriately, obviously. Yet there is a much greater risk that if I leave my blood pressure uncontrolled volitionally, I'm inducing my own complication and possibly death.
That's right.
So I think that's where some of the nuance of what we do lies.
Yeah,
that's why some of the informed consent, which is physically doing, you're physically allowing me to do something to you, comes in.
Exactly. So at the end of the day, it comes down to the will, right? The human will, volition, the decision, which has to be informed. That's why we talk about conscience. Again, the added value, the Latin conscience is another compound word. Cum scientia. Cum scientia. Cum is with science, with knowledge. We form our conscience with knowledge, right? And you just gave another example of hypertension, which could be a comorbidity. One patient could have hypertension, the other one could not have hypertension. They have different risk factors when they both go into dialysis, and even just the medication. And it's what is known as compliance, right? Is the patient compliant or not? And of course, the doctors frown on their patients who are non-compliant. That's their headache. That's the doctor's headache, is a non-compliant patient, right? And it could be something as simple as taking a pill from the doctor's perspective, but from the patient perspective, after taking that pill for 50 years, exaggerating 50 years, maybe 30 years, and it just gives me this sour taste in my mouth. I don't want to take that pill anymore. So it really is very patient-centered. But these are, the comorbidities are very important. By the way, what I mean by comorbidity is the other health issues of the patient, right? How healthy or unhealthy the patient is overall. Okay, let me give you another example here, which is the respirator or ventilator. And now, again, this is not a very clinical distinction. I'm using these terms separately more for bioethical purposes. But so for the clinicians in the group and for pre-med students also, I'm using these words in a particular way: respirator versus ventilator, or the vent, okay? So respirator, I'm saying, is assisting the lungs. They're assisting by providing oxygen, pure oxygen. Whereas a ventilator, depending on the settings, may assist or substitute. breathing is a vital function, breathing. All right, so let's look at some examples. What I'm calling respirator, which again is not strictly clinical, but you follow the argument. They assist breathing. For example, this known as a cannula, right? It's typically connected to pure oxygen. That's why one should not smoke inside a hospital room, is because they have outlets on the wall for pure oxygen, which is flammable. And so it's providing pure oxygen to the nose. But the lungs are still breathing on their own. The lungs are breathing on their own. They're just getting enriched oxygen instead of the, what, it's about 16, what is it, 16% oxygen in the atmosphere right now, more or less. So they're getting 100%, right? And so the lungs have to do less effort if there is some occlusion of the lungs, whatever. Fewer alveoli are able to get more oxygen proportionately with pure oxygen. Okay, so that's the cannula. It's the least invasive, if you will. It's external, minor discomfort of having this thing in your nostril. One step up would be a loose mask. A loose mask is, you can see, it's just a little strap, all right? And the oxygen, you can barely see, there's a little tube here that is providing oxygen, but it does cover nose and mouth. So the person may breathe through nose and mouth, and if they're sleeping, typically when we sleep, we open our mouth and we also breathe through our mouth, you know. In fact, that whole apnea thing of snoring. So this is also providing oxygen, but it's a little more aggressive than this, if you will, but it's still just assisting. The lungs are breathing on their own. The maximum assistant, typically known as a Cpap, I understand, the Cpap, right, is a mask that is tightly fit around the mouth and nose and strapped down, two straps tightly, so that the oxygen is being pumped in, but the lungs are still breathing on their own. Even though this is a maximum, it is positive pressure on the lungs, but technically the lungs are still breathing on their own, okay? The CPAP. So it can still be considered assisting, but not substituting the lungs. Different is the vent. So obviously the machinery is going to be more sophisticated, and here's the vent machine. In fact, down here is kind of a bellows. It's a diaphragm, artificial diaphragm that inflates and deflates, and it is pumping oxygen directly in, but the tube is inserted all the way into the lungs. The tube is down the trachea into the lungs, okay? And so that's why I say it depends on the settings of the machine, of the vent, depends on the setting, how much oxygen is being pumped with what kind of force, all right? And we can talk about percentage. If the machine is doing 100%, in other words, the bellows inside is actually inflating and deflating the lungs, you know, expanding and contracting the alveoli, that's 100% substitute, that's substituting the lungs, okay? What the measure is something called perfusion, which is essentially the percentage of blood in, the percentage of oxygen in the blood, which I find is a little fascinating as a non-clinician, you know, I'm fascinated by some of the technology that's available today. This little strap that is put on the finger, all right, it's actually detecting, imagine this, the amount of oxygen inside the blood. I think it's some kind of an electrical charge that goes through the skin. Again, clinicians, please correct me. I thought at first it was heat or sweat or something like that, but no, I think it's an electrical charge that measures the percentage of oxygen in the capillaries of the finger, all right? And that determines the percentage of oxygen in the bloodstream, which should be above 95, 96, 97, 99, or 100 is better. Okay, I know again from a friend who was intubated for actually 3 weeks, which was extraordinary, that when the perfusion goes below 96 or 95% oxygen in the blood, all the bells and whistles go off, all right? And all the technicians come in and adjust because the body, the patient is losing oxygen. And the big to do, of course, is oxygen to the brain, right? Because within minutes, the brain can become hypoxic, low oxygen, or anoxic, no oxygen, bad news for the brain. Within minutes, the person could die. So they follow the perfusion with that little instrument on the finger, just amazing. And then they match up the pumping of oxygen into the lungs. Also, it's a very dynamic system and quite aggressive, if you will. Like any organ or system of the body, we become accustomed, right? We become accustomed. It's like, for example, the more we sleep, the more we want to sleep. Okay, and the more we eat, the more we want to eat, and so forth. So we become accustomed. And if the lungs are getting 100% oxygen and all the effort, the literal muscular effort is being done by the machine, then why should I worry? If I'm being expanded and contracted, artificially and supplied 100% oxygen, why should I worry? Why should I do any effort, right? Why should I lung burn any ATPs? And so the lung becomes lazy. Literally the intercostal muscles of the ribs and so forth, and the diaphragm, they become lazy. Therefore, we don't want lazy. We want the patient to heal. We want to get the patient out of the bed. And so there's a weaning process that begins practically almost immediately after intubation, all right? And the weaning process is that within a short period of time, this technician is monitoring how the lungs are responding, or rather how the lungs are responding to that perfusion. And if the perfusion is high, then they'll bring down a notch on the percentage of the pumping, all right? They'll bring it down a notch and see how the lungs respond. And if the lungs maybe the perfusion goes down to 97, but then within an hour or so, it's back up to 98, 99, it means that the lungs are responding. So they'll bring the machine down another notch, another percentage, okay? And that's called a weaning process. Weaning, all right? They are diminishing the amount of effort that the machine is doing, that the vent is doing on the patient's lungs to see how the patient's lungs respond. It could be, for example, let me give you a classical clinical scenario, pneumonia. Pneumonia, the lungs are occluded and so it's overwhelming. The immune system in the meantime is trying to fight the pneumonia, the pneumococcus. The patient is on antibiotics to assist with the immune reaction, right? And so the patient normally is responding well to the antibiotics, meaning that is gaining ground on the infection. The infection is diminishing, so proportionally, the inflammation of the lung should also be diminishing, meaning that there's more surface area of the alveoli for breathing, and therefore the progress is to wean the patient off the vent. What's the standard? A week, right? 7 days. So antibiotics for 7 days and see how the patient progresses. And then if the machine goes to, I think it's about half and half more or less, but again, I'm not sure of the setting. By the time the machine is doing maybe 60 or 50% of the breathing, that's the critical moment, all right? Of course, here, it's not the nephrologist, obviously, it's the pulmonologist who decides, makes the decision, the critical decision, extubate or not. And the extubation is actually kind of exciting from a clinical perspective. I actually watched one time, again, this friend of mine, the doctor, the clinician, whoever is going to do extubation will go right up to Oh, so another thing that happens clinically is that typically the patient is induced coma. Induced coma, you can see the patient here is not alert, right? From the face, very relaxed face, closed eyes, in contrast with this fellow who is totally alive, I mean, totally alert and kind of wondering what are they doing to me. This other fellow is has a facial expression totally relaxed, right? Okay, but it's an induced coma. And the induced coma will have several physiological effects. Is at the same time a somnifer. In other words, it's a sleeping gas, right? But also it is a muscle relaxant. So the patient doesn't move voluntary muscles. We don't want this arm to go up and hit the instrumentation, for example, involuntarily. All right. So it's a muscle relaxant, typically of the skeletal muscle. We need the smooth muscle to work, right? Etc. So the patient is in an induced coma, which means that simultaneously with extubation, with the weaning process, they also need to, toward the end, toward when they're getting close to the extubation, I don't know, several hours before, I don't know how long, but sometime before the actual time of extubation, the patient needs to become more and more conscious. Because at extubation, that patient needs to take his or her breath, first breath, again, just like a newborn takes that first breath, okay? And that's the critical moment because that lung is now either gonna function 100% or not. So typically the clinician, the pulmonologist who's gonna extubate will get right up to the ear of the patient and is gonna be pulling, extracting the tube that is all the way down into the lungs, right? It's gonna extract that firmly, gently, but firmly and consistently out. And at the same time, it's telling the patient in a rather loud voice, don't breathe, don't breathe, don't breathe, don't swallow. I said, don't swallow. Don't swallow. Don't swallow, don't swallow, don't swallow, because this tube is going through the trachea, and it certainly doesn't feel nice to have a tube coming out in the opposite direction through the trachea. Don't swallow, don't swallow, don't swallow. And then once the thing's out, now breathe. Okay, breathe is the crucial moment. And God willing, the patient will now take a deep breath and breathe. And okay, the patient is back. We have restored the patient to life through the proper protocol. And it involved a vent. And more than 2 to 3 weeks is not indicated because the throat becomes irritated and there is an increasing danger of not only inflammation, irritation, but also infection, right? This is a little bit open to the environment. So infection, and of course, to get a lung infection on top of whatever illness the patient has is not good news. So within 2-3 weeks maximum, there has to be a decision. If the patient continues to be on the vent and not responding to the weaning process, the decision to do a tracheotomy or not, okay? In other words, the vent cannot be maintained for more than 2-3 weeks maximum through the throat, through the mouth. And at that point, the patient is not responding, then a decision has to be made, which is not only a clinical decision, but also a bioethical decision to do a tracheotomy or not. So tracheostomy is the hole, as os is mouth or hole, right? And os, we talked about the cervical os. Ostomy is opening a hole on the trachea, through the trachea. So I just changed the words here, sorry. Tracheostomy is the actual surgery of the hole. It's minor surgery. It's not a big deal clinically to do a tracheostomy, all right? And then the tube is hooked up now from the outside, okay? And now this tube may be maintained indefinitely, in principle, indefinitely. Now this has bioethical implications, because let's say the patient is on a persistent vegetative state. Okay, it's a vegetative state. In other words, not the brain stem, but the brain cortex is dead. You put a vent on that patient, in principle, you can maintain that patient indefinitely. And the dual combination, that is a very difficult bioethical decision, is the combination of a vent and a peg. In other words, a feeding tube to the stomach directly. You're bypassing the throat altogether. The patient is on vegetative state in a bed, on a bed, with a vent and a peg, meaning that they're getting breathing artificially, they're getting fed artificially, and that patient may be maintained indefinitely, even for years. And I've literally seen patients, young patients, grow on a bed and being there for years. And the maintenance on that body, think of the cubitus, the breaking of the skin and so forth. The patient has to be turned every few hours, day in, day out. So it's huge, huge maintenance, right? And it's a very challenging thing. Event, especially when it's combination with the PEG. We'll get to the PEG later on when we talk about nutrition and hydration. But I just want to mention that that's a bioethical decision that is a very difficult one. And again, we have to go patient by patient. Here, because the patient now is in induced coma, the documents that were signed before, so someone mentioned consent, right? Informed consent or proxy consent, the next of kin, either the spouse or the parents, if it's a minor and so forth, have to do a lot with this decision of whether to do the trach and reconnect the vent here, right? That said, I can tell you that a patient can also live with a vent, with a tracheostomy forward after, let's say that they got a vent, they got a tracheotomy because they did not recover in time. The 2-3 weeks were spent and the person did not improve enough. So they had to do a tracheotomy and put them on the trach tube for a while, but eventually the patient did recover. Took them longer, but they did recover. They restored their health, and now the vent is contraindicated, is superseded, and can be disconnected. That person with a tracheostomy, with a hole through their underneath the throat, is perfectly viable, can live, no problem. They can swallow because the esophagus, and they can breathe, but the vocal cords are damaged, okay? So typically they cannot speak on their own, but they can also use a little apparatus that is put on the side here that detects the waves and translates it into word. So they can talk, the apparatus, at least the older ones are a little funny. They have a voice that is a little mechanical like that, okay? But they can talk, they can breathe, they can swallow, they can live. Basically a normal lifestyle, but they do have to cover the hole because it's a stoma, it's an os, it's an opening right down into their lungs, okay? And so they need to cover it. Sometimes they put a little stuff like this and then cover that. Just part of it is hygiene, part of it is aesthetic, see? And that's what it is. So people can live even after a tracheotomy.
Sorry for my ignorance, but that cannot be reversed.
Sorry, no, they can. I don't know exactly why, but the os, they cannot seal it. That I know of, they cannot close it back up. And even if they did, the damage to the vocal cords is a permanent damage. So I really don't know why they don't close it up. I guess, so is the patient totally breathing from here? That I don't know. I think maybe the trachea, the damage to the vocal cords is such that now they have to breathe through here only. Because sometimes they have to clear also. This can get mucus and it has to be cleared, and the patients have to clear that, by forceful air out. But I think this becomes their only means of breathing now. Any clinicians can tell me about that? I'm not sure.
What was the question?
So why is the os not closed back up afterwards? Are they breathing through here? Is that it?
Yeah, they breathe
yeah.
through here.
So in other words, the nose is bypassed.
They breathe through here, and
Yeah.
at the end, if they don't need it anymore, they take it out, and they healed by second intention. Normally they heal. They don't close it. Normally they don't close it surgically.
Right. It's not closed.
Close it.
Right. But the os needs to be open because that's how they breathe. So in other words, they will no longer breathe through the nose. And that's because the larynx becomes occluded, or what? The vocal cords? Yeah, the larynx becomes occluded, damaged irreversibly. That's also why the trach has to be removed at some point, no? They cannot leave, I mean, here the vent through the mouth.
But at the end, when they take it out,
Yeah.
when they don't need it anymore, you close them, they can have a breathing normal by the mouth or by the nose.
Yes, if they take it out without, before the 3 weeks. Yes.
Father.
Yep.
Right. So the process, the pathologic process is tracheomalacia because of the pressure of the cuff on the endotracheal tube inhibits the circulation. So you have basically the cartilage tissue die. And then it can no longer support itself, so it collapses in. So to avoid that, they put the tracheostomy, which is below.
Right. There you go.
And then that preserves the trachea in most folks. And eventually it may be possible, depending on, as you said, this is all individual to the patient, be able to take out that little tracheostomy tube and leave it as Dr. Farid said, close under secondary intention, let it close back up. And in certain cases, you can cosmetically close it just because of aesthetics or because of the environmental issues, because it does require some maintenance. So in some folks, they still will preserve the ability to breathe, quote unquote, through their nose, mouth, but essentially what you're saying, they're breathing through their vocal cords again. Okay. So in some cases, it can be saved.
Thank you. Now you gave me the clinical answer. It actually it has to do with the cartilage mostly. Remember the trachea, in contrast with the esophagus, right? The trachea has these little rings that are of cartilage to maintain it open, precisely. Because we don't want the trachea to collapse, right? For example, when there is an anaphylactic shock and there is inflammation and it closes, well, that's life-threatening. The esophagus, in contrast, is soft and basically is closed unless there's a bolus, there's food going through. And it's a smooth muscle, but the trachea needs to remain open naturally for breathing, for gas exchange. And so it has these little rings of cartilage, which, as Dr. Jose explained, degenerate, lack of circulation, right? And so they die, And depending on the damage, maybe some of those rings are still functional, it was minimal, and they're able to regenerate, I guess, the actual cartilage tissue and they manage to maintain the trachea open.
Correct.
There you go. Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay.
This is now very frequent with the COVID patients. Many COVID patients.
COVID for intubation, yes, exactly. I mean, this was a big deal with especially the early wave of COVID, right before vaccination, and the overwhelming of hospitals and how all the events were, it was drastic. I remember seeing in the news live patient beds. This was in Europe. I think particularly in Spain, it hit so hard and so fast that they had patient beds out on the street in the middle of the sidewalk because the hospital was overwhelmed. Okay. The hospitals, they also have a socialized medicine system and so forth. So I think part of it has to do with that. But anyway, it was just horrible to see the overwhelming of the initial protocol, which was automatic intubation, right? Lack of breathing. Now the protocol, I believe, has changed, And it's better, actually. They don't, first of all, they don't admit you, they send you back home with lots of medication, but also vaccines have helped tremendously on that and so on and so forth. But the early wave, right, go back to 2019. Well, it was the end of 2019, right? So 2020 was the big, 2020. That first half of the year from April forward of 2020, drastic. I don't think vents have seen more action in the history of medicine than 2020. All right, folks, we're down to the wire here with the third example of the heart. Back to the ticker. Okay, so CPR, consider this. CPR may assist or substitute the heart. Again, we have to combine, structurally and functionally. But I always tell my students, think functionally. What is CPR doing functionally is restarting the heart, right? So if one is restarting the heart, it means that the heart stopped. The heart stopped. Now, it may have stopped for any number of reasons. Stress. Okay, but CPR basically restarts the heart, compression and so forth. So the technique is rather aggressive. Some of you may actually be certified in CPR. I know some students who are certified. I'm not, but the technique is pretty impressive to those compressions on the chest. So it depends. It depends. The one factor. What is the one factor that you think jumps to mind right away? Whether the compressions are CPR is assisting or substituting the heart functionally.
Well, it depends on how much time you're spending on doing it.
Well, time, yes, of course, but it's within minutes, right? You hear of some of this.
I did it last summer.
The EMTs. You did? You were certified for CPR?
Well, yeah, teachers have to be. And
Oh,
we have
interesting.
Yeah, and a teacher, it was interesting. She what happened to her at the end was how do you call epilepsy? But she went completely dead.
Right,
And
right.
those of us who were by her started doing the CPR, and when we called the rescue, they told us to continue. And it's very strong, Father, because it's you get tired, so they said change, but don't keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. And so anyway,
so you were several people taking turns on it, yeah?
Yes, and
that
pushing
helps
the
a little
others.
bit because it's tiring.
Yes,
I've heard some people doing CPR for 10, 15 minutes, and it's exhausting on the one who's doing the CPR, right? So those compressions can take a toll, and the big factor first is age. It makes a difference to do compressions, chest compressions, on a 20-year-old or an 80-year-old. Okay, and so what happens with the 80-year-old is, of course, that on average, that person has already lost calcium in their skeletal system, and there's a bigger danger of cracking a rib. And cracking the rib may follow puncturing the lung. All right. So now you have an 80-year-old whose heart has stopped, and with the compressions, now they have a cracked rib and they have a punctured lung, in addition to cardiac arrest. So it just got very complicated for that poor 80-year-old person, right? And that's why it depends, like in nursing homes. And therefore, the big thing in nursing homes is the famous order of DNR. DNR, do not resuscitate. We'll get to it. In a couple of classes, we'll look at all of the forms, consent and DNR and the power of attorney and all those legal things, okay? In a couple of lectures, 2-3 lectures. But basically, that comes into play. So the age makes a big difference. The condition, the actual physical condition of the patient also makes a difference, and so forth. Therefore, what I'm trying to say by all this is that there may be some cases where CPR is contraindicated for a person who has undergone cardiac arrest. Okay. And again, it's a very difficult decision, especially if the person is unconscious. In principle, we can say that the default would be to do CPR, right? The default. But at the same time, one should be calling 911 right away and so forth. And the EMTs will be monitoring. They'll ask you to monitor other vital signs and so forth. But we can say that the default perhaps is to do the CPR, but there are exceptions. Just like in everything, there are exceptions. Depending on the overall condition of the patient, we may just allow that patient to die in peace from a heart attack. Okay. And even though a heart attack is very impressive, again, clinically, you think about it, it's a very fast death for the person, for the patient. Okay, it's a very fast death. Within minutes, they're out. For the people around them, it's very difficult because it's a sudden death and there was basically no goodbye, etc. You know, and at the opposite end, I see at the opposite end of the spectrum, for example, cancer. That is prolonged cancer, a person with cancer for maybe even years on treatment and so forth, and they go in remission and then they go in relapse, but one has had plenty of time to say goodbye, right? And to show their support and encouragement and so forth. So you have the two extremes. Heart attack, boom, it's over.
Father Chofi, from when we do the CPR training,
Mm.
we were told that if you are certified and you don't assist, in a way you will be considered,
Liable.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how do you know the difference?
I just don't know legally, so we don't have any lawyers in this cohort. I wish I had a lawyer sometimes because these questions come up and they transect. And maybe some of the medical doctors may know if one knows CPR and is certified, not just knowing CPR, but actually certified, right? That bumps it up a notch. Is one obligated in principle with cardiac arrest? Because, well, it could be epilepsy, but epilepsy includes cardiac arrest, no? So is one legally obligated? It goes a little beyond the bioethics, but is one legally obligated? Anyone know? I don't, frankly. You're saying that they told you in the training that you are obligated?
Well, yes, if you see that somebody and you have the certification and
Yeah.
you decide not to help, I mean, there's a lot of ethical issues involved, because what if the person dies and you were trying to help and but we were told that it's kind of an obligation to assist, at least to do something.
Right. Well, but you see, now it's a moving target. Kind of an obligation, sounds like there are exceptions. Also, or to do something. One thing is to do CPR, another thing is to call 911. I think there's an obligation to call 911 anytime we see someone in distress.
But remember,
Good
that
Samaritan
there's-
laws should cover you.
So,
But unless you were like an on-duty physician or on-duty nurse or other emergency provider.
yeah, they should. Well, if they are EMTs, yes, emergency medical technicians, right? If they are EMTs or firefighters, for example, they do have an obligation, no? Because that's in their protection. But I think that they're also protected from liability legally, the EMTs, aren't they?
Yeah, I think this is what, like we started out, a kind of a state law issue. So
Okay.
there are in the state of Florida first responder
First responder.
liability laws that
Protections.
kind of protect the first responders to a greater extent.
Mhm.
And there are, as was stated, broader Good Samaritan laws.
I
So
see.
even if you're not certified, you can still
Mhm.
help within the context of your best abilities. Now, a particular law that requires those certified with CPR to perform CPR. I'm not aware of. I don't say it doesn't exist, but I'll have to look that one up because I've never ran into that question before.
Dr. Martinez, I think you're right. It's about the Good Samaritan kind of thing. So that's what
Okay,
I
there you
thank you.
go. Right.
That clarifies me.
Okay, so, right, so ethically, there may be, but you have to make a very quick decision there, hopefully consultation with other people in the room, okay? But yeah, legally, so there's a Good Samaritan protection, maybe. A lot is based on intention, right? What was the intention? It was a good intention and so forth. And the actions should somehow reveal that good intention. But yeah, I mean, so reason, there's no substitute for common sense, right? And reason, just clear thinking, very important to have clear thinking in crisis moments like this. But also, I mean, this thing here, when it's used properly, it's a tremendous tool, right? Because we have access, even if we're alone and someone collapses in front of us, we're not really alone. We can consult, we call. Right away, we call 911. They keep you on the line. They teach you. They coach you to do things, right, that we're normally not accustomed to doing or trained to do. And so always reach out. Don't get into a silo mentality that I have to make the decision entirely by myself. Reach out. Part of the reaching out, I mean, I get consultation calls all the time. Not as technical as this, because I wouldn't be able to tell you do the CPR or not at a distance, but I get consultations all the time. That's why I give you materials. I give you my phone number also, and you should do the same. Do the same with others, and that's how we spread the good news, right? The good news about respecting human life and taking care of each other. So never feel that one is alone. In a sense, that's why this is an extension of my being. Don't leave home without it. All right, to wrap it up, is also some technology that is involved with defibrillators. There are different types of defibrillators. Don't worry about the technicalities, but one way or another is to try to get the heart restarted, not necessarily with compressions, but with an electrical current or electrical shock going through the heart, right, to get it started. Is an alternative maybe to the compressions. Frankly, I've never used one of these defibrillator machines. There's one right across the hallway from here. I can actually see it through the door in the hallway. I would be scared to use a machine like that on someone because I know that I'm providing an electrical shock to the individual. But maybe if I would get courageous enough and it's under emergency, maybe I'll do it, trusting that the technology is going to work properly. All right. But this is like an electrical alternative to the compressions. It seems to be, it's a little more benevolent on the chest anyway. But at the end of the day,
I believe that they have to be in public places now. Like we have 3 at St. Hugh, but what I'm saying is airports, everywhere that you have to, you have to have them.
Yeah, but then who is going to use them? Who's going to be brave enough or bold enough to use them? Courageous? I don't know, because I've never been trained on this. I guess they're fairly intuitive. You just put the pads and press the button, right?
Well, CPR teach you, but also the machines. Yes, but the machine, and I'm sorry, Dr. Martinez, because you're a cardiologist, but the machine tells you what to do. And if the person doesn't need it, the machine says, don't do it.
Okay, don't do it. Don't push the button. Okay, all right. So follow the machine, whatever the machine tells you, do whatever the machine tells you, and pray to God that the machine is correct. All right. The machine is saying the truth. Pray to God.
But you have called rescue already by the time, so.
Yeah. Pray to God that the batteries are up to date and everything else. Exactly. Technology. Technology is great when it works. Okay. Right. Okay, folks, so you can see, rounding it up, basically the whole issue about vital organs, making sure that one knows which are the vital organs and which are not. There may be very important organs like the eyes, right? The eyeballs, but the eyeballs are not vital organs as important as they are for the body, for the mind, etc. When that organ starts failing irreversibly, it may be considered as the onset of death, even though it may be subtle and prolonged, etc. But then bioethically, the distinction between assisting or substituting vital organs is a vital distinction for bioethics, okay? Whereas assisting generally obligates, whereas substituting does not obligate. Okay, leave it at that.
Chofi,
Yep.
are we going to cover at any point cancer treatments?
Only tangentially, because it gets a little too clinical, but we'll see as we move forward. We'll look at, so what do we have ahead of us? By the way, obviously, we're now in the second part of the semester here. So we only have about 5 more lectures or so. We have the unconscious state, various unconscious states. Then we're going to look at the determination of death. And then we're going to look at physician euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, and then finally nutrition and hydration as an example. And that tangentially, oh yes, and consent. Another lecture on consent and the DNR, and also power of attorney. All those things that transect bioethical, clinical, legal, social. And we'll end up with nutrition and hydration, all right? So not specifically cancer as such, or cancers, different kinds, because when we talk about cancer, you have to talk about specific organs or systems, right? But we'll see it in passing, as it affects end-of-life issues.
Well, I appreciate that, because I think the majority of the people that we know in some shape or form had people with cancer, and they have, specifically I'm thinking of 2 people right now that are dealing with serious live event issues that I think is one part where we can do a lot of formation. That's what I think, and inform people of what might be the right thing to do. So thank you, Father, I appreciate it.
Sure, you're welcome. It is about a quarter, it's almost a quarter of the deaths in the United States is cancer, right? Of many different types. But if the cancer is a vital organ, of course, that's what's going to kick in, okay? So that one includes any vital organ with cancer may be the onset of death. Okay, folks, thank you very much. I know it's kind of a tough lecture, this one, end of life in general, but hopefully these things help for going forward, also with family and friends, so that you start having those conversations if you have not had them yet, right? Especially for the youth. Think of your parents, your grandparents, older people in your family or friends. Have these conversations, especially when we get to the lecture on the various forms, because they say forewarned is forearmed, right? Better to make these decisions when everyone is lucid and clear of mind than to have to make these decisions when the emergency comes and one is in a state of crisis. Okay, we're actually under time. Any other questions or comments? Crystal clear, look at that, amazing. Okay, so I'm gonna close it here. Thanks again. I wanna wish you all a happy 4th of July, Independence Day. Again, we thank Almighty God for the blessings of this country. And we think of the many, many people who have literally given their life and their health so that we may have freedom in this country, and the responsibility that we have, the bastion, the beacon of light, right, that we are to the world for the good or for the evil. It's a heavy responsibility. We kind of assume that responsibility by winning 2 world wars, but it's on us. And it's also a privilege to be a beacon for the world, okay? So let's thank the Lord, thank all those who have given us the possibility of freedom in this country, cherish it, protect it, with our lives if necessary. And enjoy the 4th of July. Okay,
Same to you, Father.
thank you.
Thank you, Father. You too. Bye-bye all.
Enjoy.
Enjoy the
Bye-bye.
Be
weekend.
happy and
Thank you,
safe.
you too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.